amino acid. Oh, peptides. Yes, thank you. Peptide derivatives. And we talked a little bit about signaling. In other words, how does that chemical messenger, when it arrives at the outside of the cell, how does it then make something happen? So we talked about the G proteins. We talked about second messengers. The two I want you to be familiar with for sure are cyclic AMP and calcium, right? Because technically those are two you've already seen, even though you probably didn't talk about it in that detail. So like when a neurotransmitter is released at the end of an axon after an action potential, that's actually triggered by calcium as a second messenger. So calcium comes in, and that's what triggers that. So you've seen that kind of thing before. Okay, and then we started in on the actual anatomy of the system, and we talked about some of this stuff over here. So this is my brain, not very artistic, but you get the gist. So cerebellum, cerebrum, brainstem. Well, in the front bottom, just underneath what would be the frontal lobe, that's where the pituitary lives. Okay, so it hangs from this little stalk down into that sella turcica, almost in the center of the skull. Like when you look down into the cavity where the brain would be, almost dead center is this region right here, right? So the hypothalamus is the bottom of what would be the temporal lobes and frontal lobes. They're not technically, the hypothalamus is not part of those lobes. They're part of the deeper midbrain structure, but it's under those. And the little stalk is called the infundibulum. Okay, that's the little, the pituitary hangs off of it, like the stem of the pituitary. The hypothalamus is the base of the brain here. It's part of the limbic system. And then the gland itself is called either the pituitary or the hypophysis. So what's the difference? Pituitary is the name of the gland. Hypophysis is its anatomical structure. In other words, if you're going to point to it, you're pointing at the hypophysis, but in that structure is the pituitary gland. Now, in truth, people use the two words like they're the same, like they're synonyms. So hypophysis and pituitary. We're going to talk a little bit more about this here in a minute, but the front part of the pituitary and back part are different, profoundly so. So the front part of the pituitary is all glandular. A gland is something that makes a chemical substance of some kind. Okay, so the pituitary gland evolved to produce chemicals, or the anterior pituitary did. The posterior pituitary or posterior hypophysis is neural. In other words, if you looked at it under the microscope, you wouldn't see a bunch of epithelial cells like you'd see in a gland. Instead, you'd see a bunch of axons like you would in another part of the brain. So the posterior pituitary is neural. So we oftentimes give these two parts different names. So the posterior pituitary, we call that the neurohypophysis, right? Because it's neural and it's part of the hypophysis. And then the anterior pituitary, we call that the adenohypophysis.
This is glandular, right?
Huh?
That says glandular?
Yes, that says glandular. Adenohypophysis. Right? So adeno means gland. So we have the adenohypophysis in the front and the neurohypophysis in the back, which is a good lead-in to where we're going to start today.
And you said pituitary is the gland, and then hypophysis is the anatomical position?
Hypophysis is the location, essentially. Hypophysis is below the brain, is what that word means. So it's the region, but really they're used interchangeably. Your book does too. Let's see, slideshow from this one. Okay, so two parts, right? Looking at, similar to my picture, you're looking at the front part of the base of the brain. And we have the little stalk here, that's the infundibulum. The hypothalamus sits above it. To give you a reference point, this is the optic chiasm. So you know where the optic nerves make that cross? Well, that cross is just anterior to the infundibulum. So it's just in front of that. The back half is the neural hypothesis because it's neural. The front half is the adeno hypothesis here. All right. So these two different parts make different hormones. The posterior hypothesis is the simple one. It makes two hormones, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and OXT is oxytocin. And oxytocin plays a role in the reproductive system, which we'll talk more about at the end of the semester together. The anterior lobe, or the anterior pituitary, is a much busier place. So we have this whole list of hormones that we're going to go over here in a minute. But TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. LH is luteinizing hormone. GH is growth hormone. PRL is prolactin. And MSH is melanocyte stimulating hormone. Okay, a lot of words there, right? The hormone names are need-to-know stuff. So yes, it's a bit of brute force memorization, but you are going to use these in your life. So it's worth knowing, and it's worth knowing their abbreviation too. Okay, so know the abbreviation. These are they're standardized. You look in any textbook or even in physician and nurse notes, and you're going to see these terms. This is how you're going to get it from the lab when you draw labs on a patient. So the abbreviations are worth knowing. I think they're an aid to learning because you learn the letters and then it's easier to figure out what the words actually are. Like this one, I have to think through, adrenocorticotropic hormone. But I know ACTH, so I get all the words eventually. Okay, so learn them both. All right? Okay, so what about these hormones? We'll start with the posterior lobe. The ADH does just what its name says, antidiuretic hormone. A diuretic is a chemical that increases urine output, right? Many of you will have heard this term sometime in your life. So probably the most famous diuretic that we give patients is a medicine called Lasix or furosemide. And it is a very effective diuretic. In other words, you give somebody a shot of Lasix and about 15 minutes later, they have urine to come out, right? At least if they're hydrated, they do. So antidiuretic hormone does the opposite. It's an antidiuretic. It turns down urine output. So mnemonic, ADH, a desert hormone. And here's what I mean by that. Stuck in the desert, you've got no water. The last thing you want to do is waste your water making urine, right? So in a desert situation, antidiuretic hormone is released. Your urine output goes down, okay? You see this, we all see this, first thing in the morning too. Urine typically first thing in the morning is quite dark compared to throughout the rest of the day. That's the effect of ADH. Reduce the amount of urine, which makes it much more concentrated. Okay? Today we just introduced ADH. When we get to the cardiovascular system, we're going to talk much more about it. When we get to the renal system, we're going to talk about it again. So for today, I want you to know it reduces the amount of water loss, and it comes from that posterior pituitary, from the neural hypothesis, from the neural part of the pituitary gland. All right. Another effect which many will have experienced is ADH is inhibited by alcohol. So one of the reasons why urine output goes up when alcohol is present is because of its inhibition of ADH. So you get to see how it works by inverse, so to speak. So that's ADH. And oxytocin does a number of different things, but they all are part of, it's a reproductive system hormone. So because of that, we're going to talk about oxytocin's effects at the end of the semester when we talk about the reproductive system. So for today, just know it's involved in reproductive stuff. So like uterine contraction, it's involved in milk letdown, and it plays a role in sexual function as well. So that's oxytocin. So only two from the posterior lobe, right? That's not bad. The anterior lobe, though, more than makes up for it. So we've got a whole list of hormones. TSH does just what its name says. Most of the hormones do, if you know what the words mean. So thyroid stimulating hormone, not surprisingly, stimulates the thyroid. Well, what does it do? Well, it stimulates the thyroid to produce thyroid hormone. And then thyroid hormone, as we'll see probably next time, has a whole bunch of different effects on the body. They all have to do with metabolism, though. Okay? Of all of these hormones, this is the one that is tested for the most because TSH is a quick test to determine if the thyroid gland is functioning normally. Okay? If TSH levels are very, very low, it means the thyroid is producing too much hormone. If TSH levels are very high, it means the thyroid isn't producing enough hormone. So many of you at some point in your life will have been tested. Your TSH level will have been measured by some lab. It's also one of the labs we do for newborns. The state panel includes a TSH test. So it's a need-to-know one because it's tested for so often, and its clinical implications are pretty obvious. All right, so that's TSH. ACTH, A goes with adrenal gland. Okay, ACTH stimulates the adrenal gland to produce hormones. Now, we'll see later, the adrenal gland is really two glands in one. The inside of the adrenal gland produces epinephrine and norepinephrine, like we saw in the sympathetic nervous system chapter, right? It acts like a giant sympathetic neuron, produces adrenaline that makes the fight or flight thing happen. Well, the outside of the adrenal gland, the adrenal cortex, produces about 10 other hormones that have nothing to do with the fight or flight response. Well, ACTH stimulates that outer part of the adrenal gland to do its thing. When you think ACTH, think steroids, because steroid hormones produced by the adrenal gland are stimulated by this pituitary hormone, ACTH. So its proper name is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Okay, wow, what a mouthful. Take the word apart, right? Lego words. We have lots of Lego words in anatomy. Adreno, the first part, that says where. That's the adrenal gland. Cortico says which part of the adrenal gland. So the adrenal cortex is what is stimulated by ACTH. So adrenocortico says where the cells are. The cortex is just outside of the thing, the outermost layer. Medulla is the inside of the thing. Medulla inside, cortex outside. So what about tropic? Tropic means to activate. So a tropic hormone, which there are lots of them, is a hormone that stimulates. It causes something to happen. So this name tells you what it does. Tropic stimulates the adrenal cortex. So this is a hormone that stimulates the adrenal cortex. See how the Lego word thing works? So take the word apart, and a lot of times it gives you a clue to what it means. Okay, so that's ACTH. The gonadotropins, so here tropic I said activates. Here's a brother word. Tropin is another word that means to activate. Gonado is gonads. So these are hormones that activate the gonads. So they're reproductive system hormones. There's two of them, FSH and LH. So follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Again, we're going to hold off on these until the reproductive chapter. Okay, but short version, FSH triggers the development of ova or eggs in the ovary, and FSH triggers the first part of sperm development in the male. And then LH is responsible for what happens after ovulation in the female, and luteinizing hormone finishes the job of sperm formation in the male. So, a little preview of what we'll learn much, much more about later on. All right, and the list goes on. GH is growth hormone. Thankfully, it does pretty much what it says. It causes growth. So what does that mean? Well, in children and non-adults, growth hormone is one of the triggers for cell division and cell growth. So one of the ways we go from infant to child to teenager to adult is because of the influence of growth hormone on cells. So growth hormone, for example, it causes an increase in bone growth. It causes muscle to get longer and larger. We'd look pretty silly if we had the muscles of a newborn, right? So our muscles and bones have to grow as we grow, and growth hormone stimulates that. It also plays a major role in how we use nutrients. So even in the adult, growth hormone plays a role in whether you're building muscle and bone strength or whether you're building lipid stores instead. So it's not that growth hormone's role ends at adulthood. It just changes is kind of the best way to think of it. In the absence of growth hormone, it's practically impossible for a child to grow and develop normally. So in patients who have a growth hormone deficiency or a pituitary tumor, let's say, they usually have to be given growth hormone from the outside in order to create normal growth. Some of the, you look at the Guinness Book of World Records and they have like shortest, smallest people and tallest, largest people. Well, most of the shortest, smallest people are people who had a growth hormone deficiency. So it shows you, what happens when you don't have enough of this. You just don't get bigger. You just stay small, right? Okay. So lots of things here. And we're going to talk more about growth hormone when we get to the digestive system chapter 2. All right. PRL is prolactin. Again, it tells you what it does. Lactose is milk sugar. So, and pro is to generate or to activate or stimulate. So prolactin is what stimulates milk production in the female after delivery of the baby. And as long as milk is drained from the breast periodically, that stimulates more prolactin to be released. So the way that milk production is sustained is by emptying the breast of milk, which the baby does because the baby is hungry, right? In agriculture, prolactin is sometimes used to keep animals producing milk too for human consumption. So you see it sometimes there too. So that's PRL, prolactin. And then the last one, and sort of the most insignificant one, is MSH. Melanocyte stimulating hormone, again, does what its name says. It stimulates melanocytes. Well, melanocytes are those cells in the skin that produce melanin, our natural sunscreen. Now, in the human being, melanocyte stimulating hormone is sort of insignificant because it doesn't change very much. It's there all the time in a regular amount. In some animals, some animals change color, throughout the year. Like certain rabbits are white in the winter and brown in the spring and summer. Well, it's because their melanocyte stimulating hormone changes over the course of the year. So it's one of the ways that animals can change color. We're not that cool. We don't change color. If we got darker in the summer and whiter in the winter, that would sort of make sense, at least in terms of UV exposure, but we're not that fancy. All right. So big, long list. Okay, so there's 7 of them. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So pituitary, the adenohypophysis, anterior pituitary, produces 7 hormones. And none of them do anything directly. If you look at this list, they are signals to other organs to do something. So it's another message in the chain. All right, so we have the pituitary hormones, and the hypothalamus also has hormones that we call releasing hormones. And there is a connection between those two things. So here, let me just do an example. All right, so in this top column, these are the thyroid. This is the thyroid axis. We call it an axis because it involves multiple things. So from the hypothalamus produces TRH, thyroid releasing hormone. RH always means releasing hormone, okay? And that signal travels from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary through that portal system we talked about last week. Remember, the capillary bed and then back to a vein and another capillary bed? Well, the hypothalamus produces this thyroid releasing hormone. It travels through that portal system to the pituitary. TRH stimulates the pituitary to make TSH. TSH then goes into the blood, finds its way to the thyroid gland, and stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormones. So we have this multi-step control process, but it's all chemical messages, right? So hypothalamus produces a releasing hormone. That causes the pituitary to make a stimulating hormone, and then that stimulating hormone makes the gland produce its hormone. So we have this multi-step process, okay? And for each of the pituitary hormones, there is a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. The only two exceptions to that are the ones that come from the neurohypothesis. So for oxytocin and ADH, no releasing hormone, but that's the only exception. The rest of them have releasing hormones. All right, so we did thyroid. CRH is corticotropin releasing hormone. It triggers ACTH, which goes to the adrenal cortex to produce steroids, otherwise called glucocorticoids. So there's another example. Okay. The gonadotropins, FSH and LH, there's one releasing hormone that triggers both. So it's kind of a split. The hypothalamus does this, gonadotropin releasing hormone. The pituitary responds with two stimulating hormones that go to the testes or ovaries and do different things. All right. So one of the ways your book describes this is as a hormone 1, hormone 2 system. So there's a releasing hormone, a hormone 1, and a hormone 2. So what does that mean? Well, the releasing hormone doesn't travel very far. Okay, it goes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, that's it. Hormone 1, though, goes from the pituitary to whatever its target organ is. So like, for example, FSH has to travel all the way to the gonads on the other end of the trunk in order to do its thing. So that's hormone 1 is FSH. These are all hormone 1s. Okay? So target organ is distant from the pituitary, but then that target organ creates a second hormone, and that's what actually makes something happen in the body. That's what actually changes cells' behavior to make some change to the body's homeostasis. All right? So we have the hormone 1, hormone 2. And all of these hormones in this list follow this pattern. Now, there's a couple of exceptions, which I guess we're going to get to after the question. All right, so pull up your Socrative thing if you haven't already. And I'm going to send you the question. So I got 6 people in the room. Go ahead and get logged in if you're not already. But the question is, when you get there, the hypothalamus controls secretion by the anterior pituitary by doing which of those things? Anybody having trouble getting connected? No? Okay, good. There we go. I've got 18 of you in the room. See, things are going to maybe work this semester. That's good. All right, tick, tick, tick. 5 of you haven't answered. Jump in there. All right. Best answer there is C. So the hypothalamus controls, here, right? Controls the anterior pituitary. Remember, there's a difference between posterior pituitary and anterior. So the way that is done is the hypothalamus makes releasing and inhibiting factors. We haven't talked about the inhibiting ones yet, but we're about to. They go into that tiny little portal system that's about 3 millimeters long, and then that triggers the anterior pituitary to release its hormones. If the question had been posterior pituitary, then A would have been the better answer, because the posterior pituitary works just like neurons do, except instead of releasing their neurotransmitters into a synapse, they release it into the bloodstream instead. Very similar to what the adrenal gland does. All right, there's another one. This is from last time. When a catecholamine or peptide hormone binds to receptors on the surface of the cell, which of those things happens? All right, 5 seconds. And the idea behind these questions is just answer. You know, like don't go back in your notes and try to find the answer. Okay, it's a way of testing what you know and telling me what you know and what you don't. Like in this case, we have a deep split between E and C. So many of you put C, many of you put E. And the best answer is C, okay, because the water-soluble hormones, so that's the amino acid derivatives like the catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? And the peptide hormones like insulin, also water-soluble. They attach to a receptor on the surface of the cell, but that's all they can do. They can't get through the cell membrane. So they make second messengers appear. So the water solubles, the amino acid derivatives and the peptide hormones, they go with that second messenger system. E is a great answer for the steroid hormones, for the lipid derivatives, because they can pass through cell membranes, through the nuclear membrane, and make something happen right in the nucleus. They can turn genes on and off. So know the difference between the lipid ones and how they work, and the water-soluble ones and that second messenger system, cyclic AMP and calcium. All right, one more. When a G protein becomes activated and causes an activation of enzymes, what happens then? Good question. Less than the best question, I have to say, for those of you who are like, wait a minute, there's more than one answer. Yeah. In some ways there kind of is, but we'll talk through that. Okay. Because G proteins can be activating or inhibitory, we talked about that. So in an activating sequence, the G protein would result in the formation of cyclic AMP. But you could also say that you can't have B without A, because ATP is formed into cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is broken down. Some G proteins, when they're activated, do break down cyclic AMP, but we usually call that an inhibition, not an activation. And D is sort of a combination of A and B. So, like I said, there's more than one correct answer here. If it were me, D is the best answer, because we're talking about an activation, not an inhibition. So we wouldn't be breaking down cyclic AMP, we'd be forming it. And how do we form it? We take ATP and we bend it into a circle and make cyclic AMP. All right. Okay, so back to pituitary target organ axis. Okay, so we saw most of the hormones follow this hormone 1, hormone 2 pattern, right? Well, what about the exceptions? In some systems, there is both a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and an inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus. Why? Why would the body evolve that way? If there needs to be very tight control over the levels of a hormone, you need to have both a stimulating and an inhibiting factor so that you can push the actual value into a very controlled spot. Growth hormone is one of those examples. So growth hormone has a releasing hormone, just like the hormone 1, hormone 2 system we saw before, but it also has an inhibiting hormone 2. So there's two actors on the pituitary gland with respect to growth hormone. The GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, stimulates growth hormone production. GHIH inhibits it. Okay, so depending on what the body needs, you're going to have one or both of these present. But after that, we still have a hormone 1, hormone 2 system. Growth hormone is hormone 1, comes from the pituitary, goes out to its target organs, which in this case there's a bunch of them. And the growth hormone on the liver produces a second hormone called somatomedins, which we're going to talk about in the digestive and metabolism chapter. But they trigger the kinds of things growth hormone does. So growth of muscle, bone, and cartilages and things like that. Okay, so the only difference here really is that we have this inhibiting hormone as well. Okay, so that's growth hormone, one exception. In prolactin, there is no hormone 2. Okay, so this is the only example where the pituitary creates a hormone that has the final end result on the body. And that is prolactin stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk. So it's one step simpler. There is no hormone 2. So I say hormone 1 is hormone 2. The pituitary hormone is the direct effector of the target organ. Okay? And just like growth hormone, there's a releasing factor and an inhibiting factor, too, for this one. So it has some of the features of growth hormone, and some in another way it's unique because there's just the one hormone, prolactin. Okay. Now, all of these hormone systems have built-in feedback mechanisms. You talked about feedback mechanisms last semester, right? So, for example, prolactin stimulates in the inhibiting factor and inhibits the releasing factor. So when prolactin levels are high enough, it turns off the releasing system and turns up the inhibiting system so that prolactin levels keep a constant level in the body. Okay, we're going to see many of examples of that as we go on this semester. All right. Okay, so this is a very busy slide, okay, but it is a great review study slide from your book. Okay, this is a 2-page spread in your book. I forget what the numbers are. But this has all of the axes all in one place. So from hypothalamus to target organ and effect, right, all in one place. So here we have the hypothalamus hormones, right? So CRH, TRH, the 2 growth hormone inhibiting and releasing, prolactin inhibiting and releasing, and then gonadotropin releasing. So all of the hypothalamus hormones, they all go through that little portal system down to the pituitary gland, and then they activate their respective second hormones. So like corticotropin releasing hormone triggers the release of ACTH, which gets the adrenal cortex to produce glucocorticoids, steroids. TRH triggers the pituitary to release TSH, which makes the thyroid gland produce thyroid hormones, and so on. So all of these we have talked about already. The posterior one looks a little different, right, because there are no releasing factors. These are nerve axons instead. So we have the production of ADH, which affects the kidney, and oxytocin, which affects the reproductive system. All right? And then the only one that sort of is missing a releasing factor is this guy, the melanocyte stimulating hormone. It arises from the area between the anterior and posterior. So in humans, like I said, it's present all the time at the same levels, so it doesn't really matter, right? But that's this gray one here. That's see, it even says uncertain significance in healthy adults because we don't change color like some animals do. All right. So a lot of information in one place, but this is a good review slide. When you're studying, you may take this slide and blank out these different ones so you can fill it in, right? So that you can follow the chains, so to speak. All right. Because from the hypothalamic pituitary relationship, now we're going to go out to the body and we're going to look at the target organs. So what are these stimulating hormones from the pituitary? What are they going to do next? Okay, and we start with the infamous for endocrine system thyroid gland. Okay, and we get a little anatomy. All right, so where is the thyroid gland? Well, it's in the neck. It sits, if you find your Adam's apple and you work your way down, you'll feel sort of a squishy region that usually people don't like particularly to be squished there, but because your airway is just underneath. But you can usually palpate the thyroid gland. It has kind of a squishy feel to it. And it sits, it looks like a bird, right? So it has a body in the center, and it has 2 wings that wrap around the trachea. Okay, so always in anatomy pictures, remember you're seeing just one picture of a 3-dimensional thing. Okay, So the thyroid gland is not flat like it looks like in this picture. Instead, it wraps up and around the trachea, which goes down through the center. So here are the great vessels going up into the head, right? So here's the carotid, here's the internal jugular vein on the right and left. And if you look at this glandular structure, one of the things that should stand out is, my gosh, it's got a lot of blood flowing through it. You know, it's got a bunch of arteries and a bunch of veins, all for this mushy bird-like tissue. Well, the reason for that is you're going to see this in all glands. In order for the thyroid gland to do anything in the body, its hormone has to get into the blood, and that blood has to be carried around to the rest of the body. So it doesn't need all this blood for oxygen or nutrients. It needs it for transport. So the thyroid hormone produces its hormones, dumps it into the arterial blood that's coming in, and then it's carried out to the rest of the body through these veins. All right. And unlike many glands, the thyroid gland is very obvious. You know, like if you got to see a head or neck surgery, or hopefully in lab, you guys will get into the cadaver lab once or twice, and the thyroid gland is sort of obvious. You can see that it's a gland and it's there. It really does have all these vessels. Yeah?
Why is it in the neck? Is it because of the blood supply and stuff?
I don't know. Somebody asked me that last year, and I don't know. In some ways, it would be smarter to put it somewhere more protected. You know, because in the neck, it's hanging out there, you know, getting ready to, lion could get you right there, you know. But that's where it is. It may be because of the blood flow. And it may be that it's near the brain that way, too. But I don't have a good answer. It could really, like all these glands, they could be anywhere.
Can you survive without your thyroid gland?
Not without taking thyroid hormone by mouth. No. You got to have thyroid hormone. You'll die without it. So people who have a sick thyroid gland and don't produce enough thyroid hormone, essentially they have many of the same symptoms of freezing to death.
Really?
Yeah, because what happens is their metabolic rate gets less and less and less. They produce less and less heat and energy, and basically they sort of starve to death in room air. So yeah, you have to have thyroid hormone for sure.
What about with hypo?
That is hypo. You mean hyper?
Yeah.
It's kind of just the opposite. People, their metabolism is very high, so they're hot all the time because they're blowing through energy. They lose weight real fast. They have trouble keeping weight on. Their heartbeats are super fast, 150, 180, even 200 beats per minute. So if they have sick hearts to begin with, that can flip them into a heart attack.
Is that why they say that hyper is more dangerous?
Hyper is harder to control.
Oh, okay.
You can always give people thyroid hormone. You can't take the thyroid hormone they're producing away. So in bad cases of hyperthyroid, they go in and destroy parts of the thyroid gland to reduce its ability to produce thyroid. So in most hyperthyroid conditions, by the time you're done with treatment, you'll have to take thyroid hormone the rest of your life, which seems counterintuitive. Well, my problem was I made too much. Well, we had to knock you down so you would never make too much again, and then we'll give you what you need. Does that kind of make sense?
And just one, sorry.
Go
One
ahead.
last question. Is thyroid hypo or hyper linked with diabetes in any way? Because I feel like a lot of the cases that I see that when people have thyroid in there.
Well, if you're hypothyroid, you'll tend to put on weight. And when you put on weight, your risk for diabetes type 2, anyway, goes way up. So that I could see. I mean, there isn't a direct relationship. They work on different things.
Okay.
But both insulin and thyroid hormone work in metabolism. So you could definitely see both in the same patient. Yeah, you had a question.
So for going off of her question, you can, if you take the hormones, or if you take the thyroid hormones, you can survive without that.
Yes, you just would have to take them every day. Yeah. And they have a pretty long half-life in the body, so, you'd have to take them twice a day. But there's almost never a case where your thyroid doesn't produce any of your own. Everybody produces a little. Even somebody with a super sick thyroid still does. But let's say it was a massive cancer and they had to take the whole thing out. You would just have to take your medicine every day. And you'd know if you skipped a dose. Because you'd start to feel cold. Your family and friends would notice that you had slowed down. Hypothyroid people, it's like their accelerator is on idle. You know, they barely move. They're very slow. So there are obvious effects.
Are they in pain? Or
No, it doesn't hurt. They feel bad, though.
Uh,
You know, it's almost like having a really bad viral illness. They feel like they have no energy. They can't get out of bed, that kind of thing. And it's because there's no gas in the engine, so to speak. So it's just sort of puttering along. Yeah.
Are you just born with it, or can you like develop it as you get older?
Most thyroid conditions you develop with time, and there's a whole range of disorders. But both hyper and hypo, too much and too little, you develop them over time. Yeah. Cancers can do this. You know, thyroid cancers can produce too much thyroid hormone. In kids, if you are born with a thyroid condition, it has to be addressed immediately because thyroid hormone, just like growth hormone, if you don't have it in just the right amounts, you're not going to grow and develop normally. So one of the reasons we check thyroid levels in all newborn babies in this country is because if a baby has low thyroid and it isn't picked up until they're a year old, let's say, they will have cognitive deficit because of that. So they have to have thyroid hormone in order to develop properly. Yeah.
Why is it so hard to not diagnose it per se, but like I feel like when you get tested for it, they don't always pick it up right away.
Thyroid disorders, you mean?
Yeah, especially hypo. My mom had to be tested several times before they're like, yep, now you have it. But
It's gotten better. It used to be that treating thyroid hormone problems was a little too witch doctory for our modern way. Because, like, what is the normal range, for thyroid hormone? People will give you different answers to that. Depends on who you ask. Some endocrinologists think that everybody should be right in the middle of that range. Some endocrinologists think, you're a little low, but you seem fine. You're not overweight, you're not having heart or cardiovascular issues, so why would I put you on medicine if there isn't anything wrong with you? So there's more debate, I guess you could say. I think most modern endocrinologists would say it's better to be where it should be than to be too little, because it does have long-term effects too.
so it depends on the doctor and not really the number.
Yeah. Well, and there was a fad in the 1960s, 70s, 80s where people were trying to get their hands on thyroid hormone to lose weight too. So, just like you all that will take care of patients that are human anyway, are going to find drug-seeking behavior that happens, and that's another one, is thyroid hormone is an effective way to lose weight, but it's also an effective way to die trying to lose weight because too much thyroid hormone makes your heart beat too fast. It can really jack up your cardiovascular system and your respiratory system. So don't do that, ladies. It's not worth it. All right. Okay, so that's the basic anatomy. So this is what it looks like under the microscope. So these epithelial cells right here surrounding this big open space, those are the cells that produce the thyroid hormone, okay? In between those cells, you see how there's these regions that look a little different, like here and here and here in between? Those are called C cells. C cells, or clear cells, produce a different hormone. They produce calcitonin. Calcitonin tones down calcium. In other words, it reduces circulating calcium levels in the body. Okay, so calcitonin, it has a brother, parathyroid hormone, which we're going to talk about in a minute, that raises calcium levels. Okay, so calcitonin, or C cells make calcitonin, they're these guys, but most of the thyroid gland is made up of these cells, and they produce thyroglobulin. So what's in these big glassy-looking regions? It's stored up thyroid hormone. So you get the sense from questions there. Thyroid hormone is super important in the body, so you have to have it all the time. So the body keeps a storage of thyroid hormone all the time. So if the pituitary gland says, we need a bunch more thyroid hormone right away, the thyroid gland doesn't have to make it. It's already made. It just has to be released. Okay, so what you find in these follicles is what's called thyroglobulin, and it is essentially thyroid hormone that's in an inert storage state. so it can be released into the blood very rapidly if that's what the pituitary says to do. All right, so that's what you find in here. Okay. Yeah, we have just probably enough time for this. So, okay, this is a classic example of what I love about your book. Okay, when you first look at this, you think, oh my gosh, this looks terrible. Well, think how much more terrible it would be if you had to read 10 pages about it, right? So they've taken this really complicated idea and they've made it a series of steps, and they're going to show you some pictures along the way. So you obviously start where they say start. All right, so what are we looking at? Here's a capillary. Here is a thyroid gland cell. And here is that follicle cavity, right, where that thyroglobulin is. So we have a path into that follicle cavity, and then we have a path back out into the bloodstream. Okay. So here on the thyroid cell membrane, right here, we have a pump that is sensitive to TSH. Remember, TSH is the message from the pituitary that's going to control the thyroid gland. Well, we know exactly how that message works. And that is TSH stimulates a pump on the cell membrane to pump iodine into the thyroid cell. Iodine, right, or iodide, which is its I- state. Iodine is what you find on the periodic table. Iodide is one extra electron, okay? Well, it's a pretty rare ion in the body. The thyroid gland is the only thing in the body that uses iodine, but it requires iodine too. So no iodide or iodine in your diet, and you don't have a functioning thyroid gland. Okay, and the reason for that is because iodine is part of what makes thyroid hormone, T4 and T3, yes?
Is that why they put it in our salt?
That is why they put it in our salt.
Just for this?
Just for this. Because, here, we'll finish this up next time, because this is a good story. All right, so here in America, particularly where we are, in Omaha, we are about as far as you can get on Earth from oceans, right? The principal source of iodine in our diet is seafood, ocean, because the ocean has quite a bit of iodine in it. So what happened as human beings moved away from the oceans and into the inland, they started to get into iodine deficiency. Well, no iodine, no functioning thyroid gland. So they would develop what's called a goiter. I've got a picture later in the slide set. But basically, the thyroid gland gets bigger and bigger, trying to produce thyroid hormone that it can't produce because it doesn't have any iodine. So the thyroid hormone or thyroid gland is doing the best it can. It's bigger and bigger, all girly and nasty, but it can't produce anything because there's no iodine in the diet. So what do? So back in the 1850s and before, huge numbers of people in the Midwest and in the landlocked regions of the world had these big goiters, these giant thyroid glands. So how do you get iodine into millions, hundreds of millions of people at once? Well, you put it in something that everybody uses, and in this case, it was salt. So they took salt, and now, by government mandate, there is a small amount of iodine added to all salt. Not just the table salt you buy at the store, but the salt in everything that you eat, that you buy as well. Now, you can buy salt without it, but don't. Why would you do that? Yeah.
So what about like sea salt?
Sea salt naturally has iodine in it.
Okay.
If it's actually sea salt. In other words, if they took ocean water and they bubbled the water out and you've got salt, iodine should be in there. So sea salt you should be safe with.
Okay.
What you don't want to do is go hunting for non-iodized salt. Iodine isn't going to hurt you. It's good for you. You need it. Not all countries in the world do this. So like in certain parts of Central Africa and Central Asia, there is still the problem with massive goiters because there is no iodine supplementation. When we get, this works so well, and I know we're out of time, but the iodine supplementation works so well, now they do it for a bunch of other things too. But it's not in salt, it's in flour. So how do you get something into huge numbers of people? Put it in something that everybody eats, like flour. So today, in the United States, in flour, there's folate that's added, there's iron that's added, and there's a whole slew of B vitamins that are added, which means that in this country, we hardly ever see vitamin deficiency because anything you eat that has flour in it has a bunch of these little vitamins in it too. You're going to ask a question.
Yeah, how long would it take for you to see like problems if you didn't
iodine? Like,
Oh, years.
Oh,
Yeah, because the bones store some iodine too. So like, let's say you went on some vision question, you decided iodine was a bad thing. It's probably going to take you 2 or 3 years before you're going to see any effects.
but you will see it.
Eventually you will. Yeah.
Excess, do you want it?
Too much iodine, yes, can be toxic, but you'd have a hard time finding that much. That would be like drinking the iodine from your medicine cabinet. Bad idea. Yeah.
So if you already had a goiter, but then you started consuming iodine, would it like go down? It would get better.
It's one of the treatments. It's iodine supplementation.
So you don't get it like removed, like your goiter, like surgically?
No, I mean you could, but there's no reason to. As soon as you have the building blocks for the hormone, you'll start producing it, and then the thyroid will shrink again.
But you can see small amounts.
Yeah, it's tiny. Milligrams per day.
Oh, got it.
Yeah. All right, so we'll finish this one next time.